myself. My name is Dr. Nicholas Wright. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Human Development Institute for the University of Kentucky. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and a visual description of myself is that I am a multiracial man in his upper 20s with short black hair, with facial hair as well. And then I'm wearing a blue collared shirt with a silver tie on. Today, as I was saying before, that we're going to be talking about Black History Month and that this topic of anti-racism that's here. This conversation right here is something that is a bit content heavy, but there's great information here. It's some really important moments that we have to learn about, and I'm hoping that after this conversation we can have a little discussion or answer any questions or comments or anything that you have. So let's go ahead and jump into this. All right. So today, what we're going to do, the intentions of this monthly diversity discussion. We know that each month we talk about a different component of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we focus on different things. But during this session right here, we're going to understand the significance of Black History Month in the United States. It's important that we understand the meaning behind Black History Month and why it's important. We're also going to understand why we celebrate Black History Month, because with this one right here, a lot of people may have those questions. They ask, why do we celebrate Black History Month, or why do we celebrate this month? Why do we have a designed month for this? So it's important that we explore a little bit on it. We're also going to describe what being anti-racist means. Some people have learned this concept right here, and this concept of anti-racism, but we're going to take a deeper dive into this concept to make sure that you fully understand what the concept is, but also how you can apply that in your life. We're going to explore the best practices in action to be anti-racist. So going in that one, we're going to find out how we can practice this. We're going to commit to ongoing engagement and discussions surrounding this topic. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we think about these right here, this is something that isn't stagnant. This is something that is continuously evolving. And so is our education around it. So it's important that we stay adept and we understand what's going on. And then also an intention of this monthly diversity discussion is to actively work to build inclusive spaces here at the Human Development Institute. So we can do that as individuals, but we want to make sure that we build that space here at the Human Development Institute. It's important that we find how we can learn and actively use these topics to create a even better place here in our place of work in the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. So let's go ahead and take the dive in this. All right. So first question is just, what is Black History Month? And that's a question that most people ask. But when it comes to Black History Month and what it is, Black History Month is an annual celebration of achievements by African Americans and a time for recognizing their central role in the United States history. So recognizing this. Now, this is something that's also known as African American History Month. And this event is something that grew out of Negro History Week, which is the brainchild of noted historian Carter G. Woodson. And we're going to talk about Carter G. Woodson a little bit later. But this is a prominent African American that had these motivations in moving through it, and is a way to acknowledge other African Americans in history. This bullet right here just shows a little bit about how diversity in terms and things can change over time. I mean, when we think about how it changed from Negro History Week to African American History Month and now Black History Month. So there's not just DEI, but the term surrounding DEI changes as well. And then since 1976, every United States president has officially designated the month of February as Black History Month. So every US president has done that one. And then also, not just the United States, but other countries around the world, including Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland, also devote a month to celebrating Black History Month. And with that one, celebrating Black history, it may not always be in February, but they all devote that month in their calendar to Black history and celebrating that. So I talk so much about celebrating, and that's pushed there. But how do we celebrate? How exactly do we go about this way of celebrating with it? Okay, so when we think about this way of celebrating, that we have to understand the reason why we celebrate. And the reason why we celebrate and dedicate a month just to Black history is because throughout history, Black achievements and Black individuals have been overlooked or disregarded throughout history, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But this is how we can go about celebrating this month, okay? So of course, in this presentation, this first half, we're going to talk about celebrating in Black History Month. In the second half, we're going to talk about anti-racism. So the way that you can celebrate is by discovering African-American artists, discovering what all is out there, discovering that. Also, reading African-American authors. I mean, there's just some great literature that's out there, and it's important that we look into that to find more. You can listen to African-American musicians. You can learn important moments of African-American history. When it comes to those important moments in African-American history is United States history. So that's why it's important that we know that. And unfortunately, regardless if you were in a private school system or in a public school system, in the K through 12 school system as a whole, a lot of times those moments in African-American history, those prominent individuals, weren't necessarily taught to us. So it's important that we dive more into that. All right. So with this one, there's several influential people to Black History Month, and the focus of this one right here is on Black History Month as a whole, but to really talk about Black history facts and timeline and everything, it's going to take way more than the 60 minutes that we have right now. There's a lot of time. But I want to make sure that we can touch on a few of these interesting facts and we can get this together. I want to make sure that you learn the important facts that are here. So if we were to just touch on a few interesting facts, that Carter G. Woodson, that person I was talking about before, that in 1915 established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Going back to that with Carter G. Woodson, moving on, he had the goal of changing the world's perception of African Americans and recognizing their contributions to American society and culture. The reason this is because this is something that was overlooked or forgotten about several times where people weren't taught about it. So I wanted to make sure to highlight these individuals. In 1926, he launched a week-long celebration of Black history in the United States. So that week that I was telling you about before, he launched that. And then in 1976, President Gerald Ford officially recognizes Black History Month. So there's just some fast facts for you with that one. The ways that you can celebrate Black History Month is by learning some facts there, but also by celebrating individuals, by celebrating that. And let's make sure that we can celebrate this through discussing the artists and the authors that are here. So if we're thinking about this one, we're thinking about jazz trumpeter and vocalist Louis Armstrong. I mean, how he forms a band, the Hot Five, and has become jazz legend and cultural icon. Mainly, anyone who knows music knows about Louis Armstrong. I mean, anyone really knows that one. But we're also going to focus on authors as well and that literature that's in there. How Claude McKay, how he published a collection of his early poetry, Harlem Shadows, and it becomes one of the most important early works of the Harlem Renaissance. That's one that not everyone may know about, but when we think about the cultural exploration that's there and that literature, that scholarship that was pushed there through Claude McKay, that's something that has to be learned more about. Not only do we celebrate through the artists and the authors, but we also celebrate through athletics. I mean, we talk about these athletes and we talk more about this, and I know that we know about a lot of these athletes, but it's important that we highlight it. The baseball legend Jackie Robinson, how in 1947 he became the first African-American to break the color barrier when he's allowed to play in the major leagues. My great-grandfather was really big into baseball, and that was one of an idol of his was Jackie Robinson. And back then when I was growing up, I didn't quite recognize how important that was, breaking the color barrier that's there. But he's the one that did that, Jackie Robinson, 1947. If we think about it, that's not that long ago, because that could be in our lifetimes or our grandparents' lifetimes and so on. And also, Wilma Godin Rudolph was an American sprinter who became world record-holding Olympic champion in track and field. This is something that my father was really big into cross country. And this right here was someone that he idolized because this was 1956 and 1960. If we think about it, this is prior to a lot of the events with civil rights. So this individual was representing a flag, United States, this country, on the worldwide scene and recognize and representing it proudly, but didn't necessarily get all the rights back home. I was with us in Wilma won that in 1956 and in 1960. So we talked about celebrating in ways that we can celebrate. We can do that through learning some facts and learning about some artists and authors, and also talk about some athletes. But it's also important that we understand the history. I mean, there's so many important dates in history that are filled with Black Americans. And as I said before, unfortunately, this is something that's unfamiliar to a lot of individuals, especially these significant points in history. I mean, we only have 60 minutes, but there's so many points that we have to touch on. But I want to make sure to highlight some of these points in Black Americans in the United States. With any of these points, just because I don't mention a point doesn't mean that it wasn't significant, but I only have so much time. So if we were to start about this, we're going to start about in 1619, enslaved Africans. I mean, to satisfy the labor needs of the rapidly growing North American colonies, white European settlers turned in the early 17th century from indentured servants, who were mostly the poorer Europeans, to a cheaper, more plentiful labor source, enslaved Africans. This is something that most people know about. There in 1619. But also moving forward and fast forwarding a bit is that 1831, the Underground Railroad. I mean, with this one, it's the anti-slavery Northerners, many of them free Black people, have begun helping enslaved people escape from Southern plantations to the North via a loose network of safe houses as early as 1780s, called the Underground Railroad. So that's something that most people have learned about, and that loose network of people, getting them to the North. This is something that free Black people did, and Quakers and other people of that one, but it was a challenge to do, especially as the United States economy was focused on the cotton industry, was focused on there. So it was a challenge to get these individuals to the North, these individuals that were seen as property. And we're also going to talk about Civil War, because here it is, Civil War. It's moving here, 1861. That in the spring of 1861, bitter conflict erupted into civil war, with 11 Southern states seceding from the Union and forming the Confederate States of America. So forming that one right there. I mean, this one right here was a 4-year conflict that erupted between Southern and Northern states. And Abraham Lincoln was president at the time, and he didn't necessarily have all of the anti-slavery views, but he made sure to push for this when he had this, and he knew that he couldn't necessarily abolish slavery. A war to abolish slavery wouldn't necessarily win him the votes, but he thought first and foremost to preserve the Union, and knew that few would support him in the slavery movement in 1861. Okay. Also, we're going to talk about the 13th Amendment. When we think about the 13th Amendment in 1865, this is something that officially abolished slavery. This is something that white Southerners gradually reestablished civil authority in the former Confederate States in 1865 and 1866, and they enacted a series of laws known as the Black Codes. I mean, this is something that 1865, June 19th, and now it's a national holiday. Now we celebrate it as Juneteenth, but this is when the last Black slaves were freed. They were freed as an executive decree, and this was something that was announced in Texas. The last place was in Texas, where when that decree was made in Texas, 250,000 slaves, 250,000 Black people, they were freed. And it was something that was highly celebrated that was there. I talked about the Black Codes as well, and that's something that we'll explore a little bit more. But when we talk about those Black Codes, this is a way that people use to continue governing and placing policies on Black individuals, on Black bodies that were there. This is something that although slavery was abolished during this time, Black bodies were still being restricted. They were still finding the ways to do so. And moving on with that one is the Jim Crow laws. I mean, when we think about Jim Crow laws, by 1885, most Southern states had laws requiring separate schools for Black and white students. And by 1900s, persons of color were required to be separated from white people in establishments. So this one was something that is a famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And in this one, The court ruled that separate but equal was fair and was not a violation of the 14th Amendment, requiring equal protection for all. So this is something that ruled this and set this as foundational, as separate but equal. And this was something that in education, but also let's say in water fountains and those that said whites only, all throughout the South that was there. Then also think about 1909, the NAACP, how it was founded. I mean, W.B. Du Bois met at Niagara Falls, Canada, sparking a new political protest movement to demand civil rights for Black people. Okay, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was founded. I mean, this is something, when we talk about the National Advancement of Colored People, this was something that was created as a political protest because lynching was a widespread practice. And although it was illegal, it was still a widespread practice at this time. This is, the NAACP is something that's a permanent civil rights group and still exists today. So moving on there's so many points in history, but I want to make sure that we can focus on a few more. When we think about 1920, how the Harlem Renaissance was there and is known as the Black Renaissance or a new Negro movement. The Harlem Renaissance marked the first time that mainstream publishers and critics turned their attention seriously to African-American literature, music, art, and politics. I talked about Claude McKay before in the Harlem Shadows, but this is something was the Great Migration of Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North, and this is something that sparked that cultural renaissance. Also, moving on to World War II, how many African Americans were ready to fight what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the four freedoms. I mean, the freedom of speech, to worship, to want, and freedom from fear, even while themselves lacked that freedom at home. I talked about it before with Wilma, how she represented the United States, even when she didn't necessarily have that freedom back home. And with this one, with World War II, we're thinking about more than 3 million Black Americans registered for the service during this war. And 500,000 of them were deployed overseas. And according to War Department policy, Black and white military individuals were organized in separate units to hold separate but equal situation. And this is something where the Black individuals in this war, they fought a war on two fronts, on two different ends. One was on, of course, World War II, and the other one was racism at the exact same time. We go on 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. I mean, this was on May 17, 1954. The U.S. Supreme Court delivered its verdict in Brown versus the Board of Education, ruling unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment mandate of equal protection, the laws of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, with this one, we talked before about Plessy versus Ferguson, but this is something that 200 people from 5 different states had joined the Supreme Court. And this was something, that group that I told you about before, the NAACP, is something that pushed this right here. And that this is something that overturned that separate but equal ruling, the Plessy versus Ferguson that was there. This was Brown versus Board of Education. This was extremely foundational, especially for civil rights. We go on 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, on December 1st, 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks, who most of you all are extremely familiar with, that was riding a bus in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, when the driver told her to give up her seat to a white man, and Parks refused and was arrested for violating the city's racial segregation ordinance. I mean, that one right there, that racial segregation ordinance that I was telling you about, much like those black codes that were there, but this is something that mandated that Black passengers sit in the back of the public buses and give up their seats to white riders if the front of the seats were full. Rosa had a famous quote that was there that said that I had been pushed as far as I could stand to be pushed. I decided that I would have to know once and for all what rights I had as a human being and as a citizen. We can go on to 1964, House Civil Rights Act there. I mean, thanks to the campaign of nonviolent resistance champion MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement had begun to gain serious momentum in the United States in 1960. I mean, in this year, John F. Kennedy made a passage of new civil rights legislation, and this was something that was a part of his presidential platform. And this was something that was, was a far-reaching racial equity, supporting that in American history. And that's when he was assassinated, and it was then pushed by Lyndon Johnson. In 1965, this was some of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act sought to overcome the legal barriers that still existed at state and local levels, preventing Black citizens from exercising their right to vote, given to them by the 15th Amendment. I mean, this is one that prior to then, African Americans had to have literacy tests as a requirement for voting, and this is something that banned those literacy tests. And then finally, just because this is more recently, we're going to talk about this when we talk about 1965. So as you can tell, it's progressing over time, but these significant events are still occurring. I mean, we have 1965 here, Montgomery March. I mean, early 1965, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference made Selma, Alabama the focus of the efforts to register Black voters in the South. Alabama has been extremely historical with a lot of the civil rights movements and a lot of the opposition that was there. I mean, 1965, Alabama's governor, George Wallace, was a notorious opponent to desegregation. And this was something that, of course, was an opposition of Black voters. And prior to this right here, prior to this event, only 2% of Black voters were registered. And this is something that completely changed when a Black demonstrator was there and was shot by state troopers. And this is something that pushed a massive protest and was a march from Selma to the state capitol. Also was 1967, Loving versus Virginia. I mean, Mildred and Richard Loving were one of the first interracial couples legally married in the United States, and their union marked a pivotal moment in marriage rights for mixed individuals, so mixed families. That's 1967. This is something that makes me smile because this is my research focus on multiraciality. And as we're here and we focus on interracial marriage, when we think about this was legalized only 56 years ago. So this is extremely relevant and extremely still, it's an emerging topic that's there 56 years ago. And this is something that was extremely foundational for banning interracial marriage and interracial marriage laws. And that right there, that case was 56 years ago. But the most recent law, the last one to overturn interracial marriage, the last law around interracial marriage was there. It was overturned going back to Alabama in the year of 2000. So 23 years ago was the last one where it was overturned in the state of Alabama. And this was a vote of 59% to 41%. So it was still close even in the year 2000. The Million Man March, there's October 1995, hundreds of thousands of Black men gathered in Washington, D.C. for the Million Man March, one of the largest demonstrations in the kind of capitalist history. I mean, this is one that Minister Louis Farrakhan called for 1 million sober, disciplined, committed, dedicated, and inspired Black men to meet in Washington for this Day of Atonement. And then moving on to the 2000s, even more recently, when we think about the first president of color, on January 20, 2009, Barack Obama was inaugurated as 44th president of the United States. And with this one right here, it's that President Obama was an interracial individual. And he grew up in Hawaii and discovered his civic calling in the Black South Side of Chicago as a community organizer. So actively getting involved. Then moving on to 2020, the protests and civil unrest. I mean, the movement swelled to a critical juncture, May 25th, in the midst of the COVID-19 epidemic, when 46-year-old George Floyd died after being handcuffed and pinned to the ground by police officer Derek Chauvin. When we think about that one, there's several protests during this time for victims, and the closest one to Lexington here was in Louisville with Breonna Taylor. This is something that reignited the Black Lives Matter movement. And then lastly, 2021, the first vice president of color. I mean, January 2021, Kamala Harris became the first woman of color to become vice president of the United States. She is an interracial individual as well, and with mother immigrating from India and the father immigrated from Jamaica, and she's the first person of African or Asian descent to become a major party vice presidential candidate. I know that was a lot of information there. And when we think about the history there, that is something that there's certain points there that some people may not have known about. And there's certain points that definitely need to be explored more, but we just don't have the time for it. But I wanted to make sure that we could touch on it because those are the influential moments. Those are there, and that's what really describes Black history, but also American history as well. The reason why we're there is because we discussed this to talk more about history, but to also give us a better understanding of how it is. This history right here goes into anti-racism, it goes into discrimination. Because if you look into it in the dictionary prior to, I believe, the 1900s, some dictionaries, what it said was when it talked about Black, it just describing Black, it described opposition or filth, or it described some of these things that weren't positive at all. And looking at the history, that we have to understand that we've had over 200 years of slavery, followed by another 100 years of segregation or Jim Crow laws, or those Black codes that I was telling you about. We even discussed the whole separate but equal topic there, and we discussed that. This is something right here that shaped America's views of individuals with darker complected skin. I mean, this is something that shaped those, and we're still feeling those impacts today. We're still feeling that. And I think this is why it's a good time to talk about not only Black History Month and how to celebrate, but also the topic of anti-racism that's there, okay? So now let's talk about this. So the question that everyone wants to know, how can we be anti-racist? What can we all do? I mean, what can we do? And I understand that our goal these past few decades was to just not be racist. That's what it was. And it's good to not be racist. That's there. But I want to make sure that we can change the focus of this to not only to not be racist, but to fight against racism, to actively fight against racism. So in order for us to do this, we have to understand some topics and some terms around racism. We have to understand that. So first off, let's talk about this right here. So the individual racism and how this is. I mean, this refers to the beliefs and attitudes of actions in individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious and unconscious ways. This is something that's individual racism, is a racist assumption. This could be a behavior or a belief or an action. Unfortunately, many of us have experienced that before, been victims of that, or the ones perpetrating that, but individual racism. Also going on to institutional racism. When we think about institutional racism, how this refers to discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color and extend considerably beyond prejudice. And we're there. When we talk about institutional racism, this is something that we discussed, that the policies in the civil rights movement and throughout history, these are some of these policies that are there. And it isn't as easy to spot as individual racism because it's more subtle in nature, but this is something that's impacted through bias. And then moving on to systemic racism. So if we talk about systemic racism, we talk about that's what's there. Systemic racism refers to whites' historical and systemic oppression of non-European groups that manifest in the structure and operations of racist societies like the United States. And it's reflecting disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, education, among other factors. When we think about systemic racism, we're thinking about just an example of is in education. I mean, we had a discussion about this the other day in the DEI committee, but in this one, it's even amongst preschoolers, how Black preschoolers are 3 times more likely to be suspended for the same exact infraction as some of their white peers that are there. And this is something that's seen not only in preschool, but also throughout housing, criminal justice, education, and several other realms as well. So we talked about some terms of racism, but I also want to make sure that we can discuss some of the challenges that are present for individuals, especially individuals of color, some of those challenges that are there and the reason why we have to have this anti-racism that's there. Some of these topics are things that you may have heard about before, and others you may want to explore a little bit more. But we talk about microaggressions, how with microaggressions, how they're everyday slights. These are something that can be insults or put downs or invalidations or offensive behaviors that people experience. And this is something that can be from well-intentioned individuals who may be unaware that they engage in this demeaning way. I mean, this is something that we have to focus on impact over intent that's there. And people may have the right intentions, but doing the right things has a detrimental impact at times. Also, how isolation. And when we think about isolation, how it's the experience of being separated from others and being the only person, an individual of that identity that's there. And that's with any of the underrepresented identities. But when we have that, that's something that is challenging because people have a lower sense of belonging and they have more of a sense of otherness in there. Also, lack of representation. This goes with isolation, but we talk about lack of representation. Now, it's not seeing people in leadership roles who share the same identity as you. And this is something that it's challenging to envision yourself in that role when you would be the first one, or no one has set that path before, that you'd be the very first one. Also, the fear of speaking up. Because when we talk about fear of speaking up, it's those stereotypes that are there. Fear of speaking up because you don't want to be combative. You don't want to be that mad Black woman. You don't want to be anything like that and fit into the stereotypes, which can be challenging. And also receive any backlash that comes with it. Fitting in a space that was not made or designed for them. Fitting into these spaces that weren't necessarily had them in mind when it was being created. Also being representatives of the entire community. People relying on these individuals as the experts or for their entire group or their entire racial category. And this is something that is challenging because they understand that their opinions are now generalized to the individuals of everyone in that identity. And then also constantly needing to defend status in academia. These are just constantly having to remind people that you're a qualified individual and that you were hired for your skills, for the skill set that you have. Not only do I want to talk about some of those challenges, but I also want to give some examples of the comments that are here. Some of these comments that are targeted that make it challenging. And when we think about when people say that you are so articulate, how that's something that's more of a microaggression. And when we think about it, I think people mean it as a compliment, but we have to think about why they're saying that. Is it because they were assumed not to be as articulate to be there? It's the assumptions that are there. Also, not learning to pronounce names. There's so much power in names, so much power in that. And it's important that we take the time and truly understand people, but also treat them holistically and care for them and make sure to recognize them and all of them. Also, when people say, when I see you, I don't see race or I don't see color, and they don't see some things like that, it goes back to that anti-racism thing. It's important that we fight against that. It's important that you acknowledge individuals holistically. And also anything about affirmative action. Something that's challenging that people are qualified in that position, because that's what it is, that people are qualified with those skills to get in there. So we also have to talk about this, that what is anti-racism? Because that's our topic. That's one that we're focusing on. And we talked about those other racist terms, but what is anti-racism? And with here, anti-racism refers to the conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. So this is the conscious decisions to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. So this isn't something that's more of a one and done situation. This is something that has to be done over and over, but it's in our everyday actions. It's also that when we think about it, that these choices require ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. This is something that's ongoing, and this is why we have these monthly diversity discussions. This is why we have these, is because these DEI initiatives, so we can all have this ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection to grow in our DEI efforts, because it's not something that we can check off the box or go with it, but we have to continuously learn, continuously grow. So one way that we can do this, because I talked about self-awareness and self-reflection, another way that we can do this is we have to understand and acknowledge these concepts right here. I mean, we have to acknowledge privilege and oppression and justice that's here. We have to acknowledge that when we think about privilege and acknowledging privilege, it's how when social identities have been historically valued over others with different social identities. person's sociocultural and historical context. We have to understand privilege and understand that when it comes to privilege, that it's possible that we may have privilege in certain spaces and not in others. And understand that no one asks for privilege. No one has that. But it's important that we recognize privilege, we understand it, and we use it to create a better place for all. Also, with acknowledging institutional systemic oppression, it's moving beyond just a few bad apples or individual notion of this one, understanding racism or sexism, to focus on institutional and thus structural bias and oppression against certain groups. I mean, goes along with acknowledging privilege, but we also have to acknowledge oppression as well. At times we can look past this and we think that this is on the individual level, but we have to understand that this is more of a structural. And then acknowledging justice. When we acknowledge justice, this is something that requires the willingness to interrogate and disrupt and dismantle current institutions, which must begin with scrutinizing a look at how one is not privileged in the institution over time. I mean, when we're here, we must explore justice and we have to focus on this in a critical framework is the tough part. We have to understand justice and consider that how someone is privileged, but also why or why not? Why are they in a privileged situation? So the question on most people's mind is, what can we do? What's something that we can do? So I want to make sure to give it on two levels. One, what can HDI do? What can the Human Development Institute here at the University of Kentucky do? And then I want to give it more on the personal level. So if we're here at the Human Development Institute, we're going to think about it like this, that what HDI can do is, there's a few steps, but first, hire a readily available expert in workplace diversity and inclusion. That one is a check off the box because this is an important step on the pathway. I mean, when we can do this, not only have we done this, but we understood this was an important step in the process because this was a part of the strategic plan. The strategic plan is online, but this is something that's activity 1A under leadership. What it states is that a national search to recruit and hire a diversity, equity, and inclusion lead. That's when I was hired for this resource in this role. And I'm here to lead the work in DEI. But I do want everyone to know that DEI is something that isn't just my responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility. We can all be diversity champions here, and it's important that we do so. Also encourage an active interest in learning about discrimination and systemic racism. We're working to provide these opportunities for learning and opportunity for all of us to get together and learn in this way. This is more of a safe space, but a low risk space that we can do this learning together. And this is the monthly diversity session. I mean, this is a good example of this, but we can actually learn on this because DEI is ever changing. Also acknowledge the events occurring. This is something that we have to acknowledge these events, and that this is something that even if the events aren't a part of our own identity or our own cultures, our own identities that are here, we have to do that. And this is something that we started doing this year. How this is the reason that at the beginning of each month, how I send out that diversity and cultural event list of what all is occurring that one and each month. When I do that, it's not trying to persuade people or telling people to practice this or celebrate in this way, but it's really acknowledging that this is what's going on. And it's a way of acknowledging these celebrations, these events, these dates, but also it's a way for you to become more knowledgeable about these things. You can be clear and direct in our language, and this is especially for accessibility reasons. But we have to be clear and direct in our language, in the language that we use. I mean, this is clear communication that's here. One way we do this is through plain language. This plain language is something that allows the direct communication and for information to be more accessible for all. I mean, communication, when we think about communication, it's something that isn't just a person sending information. It's not just a one-way street. This is something that how a person receives it as well. That's effective communication, not just giving it, but receiving it. So that's how we can have that and have it in a clear and effective way. Let the colleagues know that they have your support. I mean, I just talked about this before, but letting colleagues know that they have your support, showing the support to one another is just something that's so important. And it's something that means the world. I mean, just letting people know that you accept them and you celebrate them and not just a part of them or a part of their identity, but them holistically, that they're valued as individuals. What's going on? Making sure that you recognize that. And make it clear that racism is something that is not tolerated. It's something that I talked about it before, but with direct and clear communication, but this is one with it, that this direct and clear communication is there, that we don't tolerate racism. It's something that's not tolerated, and it's racism on all levels. So I've told you about those terms, but also whether it's overt or covert racism, that is something that's not tolerated here at the Human Development Institute, or with you as an individual. I mean, this must be clear expectations, not just for some, but it's a guideline for all. Also, that start a DEI book club or committee. I mean, you can do those with your grants. I know that some grants and projects have already done that. They've already started doing that. I've talked to them about that. They have that going on. And I encourage everyone to do something like this or find ways to engage in DEI. And you can also do that by joining HDI's DEI committee. I mean, we're here, and it's a great way for you to learn more about DEI, but also to engage with one another, to show support, to have that and share expertise, but also work for change. And on a regular basis, have anti-racism training. I mean, this is something, especially when you're hiring and recruiting, but have this anti-racism training. We have to have this. I mean, this is something that has started, and we started doing those DEI trainings to certain grants in groups and things, but we also do it as a part of employee orientation to make sure that everyone has that foundational knowledge of DEI as they come in, as they become members of the Human Development Institute. We have that. And then finally, just understand that representation matters. I mean, we have to understand that when it comes to representation, that it assures that people can be themselves, that they don't have to assimilate to a system, and that they can or change just to progress, that they can be their authentic selves, that they don't have that otherness, and that they can be together. So really, lastly, I want to make sure that we can talk on tips for being anti-racist, because I know that's why most people come here, is to, yes, celebrate Black History Month and learn more about it, but also make those active ways to find how you can be an anti-racist individual and how you can fight against racism, how you can do that. We talked about how you can do that on the Human Development Institute, but now let's talk about how you can do that as an individual. So first, it's just that DEI is bold. And if you believe in inclusivity, boldly say that, boldly make those actions, boldly claim that. I know that this is something that can be challenging, and people asked this question before, is how do we keep up with DEI? You're right, DEI is hard. It's challenging, it's exhausting, and it can be mentally taxing. That's there, but we have to boldly communicate this, that we believe in DEI, we believe in inclusivity, we believe in these works and the actions that we take that are here. It's something that we don't do just for professionalism, that this is who we are and we believe in this. So make sure to boldly have that presence. Also acknowledge and correct your own implicit bias. We had a few months ago, we had a monthly diversity discussion on cultural bias that's there, and we explored implicit bias a little bit, but implicit bias is something that we have to understand. We have to understand the implicit bias that we hold as individuals. And of course, you can talk with people, or you can do some online tests or to find your implicit bias that's there. And when we're here, in order for us to reduce it, we first have to recognize that it's there, that we hold that implicit bias, that it's there, and that it's something that can be extremely challenging to recognize in others if we can't recognize it within ourselves. So the first step is to recognize it within ourselves, and then we can make the change to reduce it, to eliminate it. Also acknowledge the privilege to use them for good. When we talked about privilege before, but when we talk about privilege that's here, we talk about privilege, and privilege isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not bad, and I understand that no one asked for that, but we have to understand the point of privilege and understand why that is important to have that understanding. It's important that we use privilege in a positive way. We make sure to make that spin on it. Do the work. Read, study, learn, do the work. Okay, we talked about book clubs before, but make sure that you do that work. I mean, many people say that DEI is always changing. How do we keep up? How in the world are we going to do this? I don't get it. But DEI is ever changing, and with DEI ever changing, we have to change with it. I mean, DEI, 10 years ago, terms in DEI was different than what it is today. And same with in 10 years, it's going to be different. It's important, it's going to be there, and that's okay. It's okay that we have that changing, we progress in that way, but it's important that we grow and we change in that way, and we learn to be more knowledgeable on DEI. We have to stay up to date. We have to build the most inclusive spaces that we possibly can here at work and promote authenticity throughout amongst people that we work with. And that way we can truly ensure that people can be themselves, be their authentic individuals, and that we can have that sense of belonging. You can also advocate when identity isn't in the room. It's important that in the space that we're here, we may look around or find ways to notice that who's in the room, but also who isn't present in the room. And when we find that out, let's find ways that we can advocate, how we can pull people into the room, or how we can advocate for those identities that aren't in the room, how they're not present at those times. Let's advocate for them. Let's be knowledgeable in that. Listen to experiences without questioning their validity. In the disability pride discussion that was last week, they talked about this a little bit, but listening to experience without questioning validity. I mean, people's experiences, they may be different than yours, and that's okay. They may be different experiences and you don't have the exact same experience, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that your experience or their experience is less valid. That validity piece is still there, and it's important that we listen to people without questioning or judging the experience that they have. Also call out racism regardless of who's perpetrating it, even if it's yourself, okay? That goes with all discrimination. Even if it's yourself as the one doing it, make sure to call it out. That's how we can progress. That's how we can move that, and we can continue to take that action. I mean, when we're calling out discrimination this way and we're doing it, recognizing it is a vital step, and it's important that we call it out on ourselves. That's moving in the right direction that's here. And an example of calling out a type of discrimination is, let's say when you misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns, this is something that regardless if the person calls you out, recognize that within yourself and say, hey, sorry, I used the wrong pronouns. Correct yourself, say sorry, but make sure that in the future, it's ways that we learn and that we learn from our mistakes and we don't do something like that again. Have uncomfortable conversations with family and with friends. I understand that these uncomfortable conversations can definitely be difficult dialogues with close friends and close family members. I mean, that's something that's challenging. It really is, but it's still important to have that's there, because when we think about this, diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just a part of your professionalism or your work life or anything like that. This should be a part of who you are as an authentic individual that's there. So it's important that we call it out. That way we can create better spaces for all of us here. Also realize that you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do. I talked about it before that you may make those mistakes, but it's important that we learn from those mistakes. We apologize, we work with it, we go through and make sure that it's something that we don't do again. And then last, but definitely not least, when we think about this, I just want everyone to remember that being an ally is an action. Being an ally isn't just a noun or a title that we can claim, we can have, we can put on our resume, we can make a stamp. That's not what it is. Being an ally is an action. It's an active action. It's there that something that we have, but it's something that we all must take, and that way we can make sure to advocate for individuals. We can become more knowledgeable and educated on these topics, and we can truly be that ally. Okay, so today, I just appreciate it. I know that today was extremely content heavy. We talked about this, and we talked about a lot of things, but we covered some important topics here. But I'm glad that we could really understand the significance of Black History Month in the United States, and we could understand why we celebrate Black History Month and describe what being anti-racist means, and then also explore best practices for anti-racism and commit to ongoing engagement discussions around this topic. I mean, I know that DEI is something that's ever changing, but it's important that we grow with it. And before we end this monthly diverse discussion, this presentation right here, I want to leave you with two quick quotes. The first one is by Angela Davis, and said that in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. That's there. And then Ijama Lu said that you do not have to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including yourself. And it's the only way forward. I hope that we can all make this commitment here to be anti-racist and continue this DEI journey together.